All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Mike Petegorsky. Mike, welcome.
Thank you so much, Guy. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Awesome. So Mike is the Chief Strategy Officer of Mindbloom, the largest provider of psychedelic therapy. Mindbloom is the first and largest national provider of psychedelic therapy. They facilitated over 500,000 at-home ketamine therapy sessions in 38 states. Their mission is to make at-home ketamine therapy a mainstream mental health treatment for everybody. Mike is passionate about creating Mindbloom's legacy as the most trusted name in psychedelics. All right, Mike, before we get in here, before we dive in, and I know you're ready, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Yeah, I'm from a small town called Northampton, Massachusetts. It's in Western Mass, about 2 hours west of Boston, but before you hit the Berkshires, if you're driving east to west.
Awesome.
I went to college in Philly, spent a decade in New York City, and have been in Austin, Texas for the past 3 years. And
cool.
Yeah, it was really a big transition that happened around COVID, where I had been a big law firm lawyer in one of those big international firms with 1,000 lawyers, Midtown skyscraper, kind of like that show.
Wow.
Suits, and thought that was where life was headed, and a mixture of psychedelic medicine and really kind of taking my life more seriously than maybe I had in the past caused me to rethink all that. Left big law, left New York, came to Mindbloom to help advance psychedelic therapy, and came out to Austin to build a family.
Okay, that's the thumbnail. But let's go back. First of all, You're hitting a lot of great places in the States. I know Northampton, very cool town. Yeah, where'd you go? School in Philly.
I was at Penn, University of Pennsylvania.
Nice. Okay, awesome. So you must have been in that pipeline getting into law. Right, this is where I'm going, Penn, everything. Talk a little bit about that.
That's exactly right. Growing up in a small kind of hippie town, I think most timelines for me would have led to political organizing or teaching or something more kind of liberal arts, more human focused in some ways. And when I was applying to colleges, I got into Penn, and it was the best school on my list, and I was excited to go there. So I went, and Penn is a school where most people go into finance, and there's really this kind of business world focus and intense pressure on joining kind of that corporate ladder world, whether it's consulting or investment banking or law or something else. I never found finance interesting, but law seemed at the time like a way to do something intellectually stimulating and challenging and help people along the way. And I had visions of being an environmental lawyer or doing other things that really served the world and the people. But then you get to law school, and these big firms come for recruiting, and they tell you that first year's salary, and you say, oh, well, well, that's interesting.
Right. And climate, what climate?
Yeah. And so then you tell yourself a story that you'll make some money, set it aside, do that work, get the experience, and then eventually you'll go do that good thing somewhere else, right? And then you start doing it, and they raise the salary every year. They always kind of dangle the carrot a little farther, and so you just keep going. And so what I was doing was patent litigation. I represented Fortune 50 companies in patent cases around high-tech stuff, whether it's dental nanocomposites or shielded electrical ribbon cables or antibodies. And it's fun, but it was like gladiators for nerds. It's really hard, it's really intense, and I'm a big nerd, so I like to argue about what words mean or how the technology works. But eventually you just realize, holy cow, this isn't really helping people. This is moving money around for some big corporations. And at the end of the day, I don't know that anyone's lives were made any better by doing it. And so let me
interrupt for a second. That's a big realization. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's a simple realization, but it's huge. How did you get to there?
I mean, I think for me, the realization was at a certain point, you can either have, work is this really interesting concept in this country. It's a means to an end, in that it lets you have a house and food and maybe enjoy yourself. But it also is really a source of meaning for a lot of people. And I realized you can either do work that gives you meaning or work that enables you to do other things that give you meaning. And that's kind of the means to an end thing. And I actually realized I was 0 for 2. I was working so much, I didn't have time to do anything else. And it actually didn't give me meaning to help a big Fortune 50 company save a few million or 100 million or $1 billion. It just, I didn't care. And the way I was able to get there was actually through psychedelics. And this was obviously before I worked at Mindbloom. I had been a Mindbloom client actually before I worked here and got ketamine therapy, and I had used other psychedelic medicines as well. And they helped me get this perspective. I think, and I'm sure you've kind of experienced this, most of us live our lives right here where it's right in front of our eyes, and our whole existence is right at that level where the world meets your eyes. And then psychedelics let you step back a little bit or get a bird's eye view, a different perspective on it. And you see these ways in which you move about your job, move about the world, kind of following some script or pattern. And you say, when's the fun part? When's the meaning? When's the value? When's the part where I'm really going to do something that helps people? And that was really, psychedelic medicine was really what let me realize that I was on a path to nowhere.
Excuse me. What led you to psychedelics in the first place?
Well, I had struggled with anxiety for my whole life. And it was mostly in a social context. I mean, so to answer your question, it was other things didn't help me and I needed to try something new. The longer story is I struggled with social anxiety really kind of as far back as I can remember. I mean, this is kind of sound kind of odd, but it started with sweating. I would get sweaty. I was made fun of. Trauma is a word that I try to use carefully because I think, I'm not a clinician. I'm not a mental health provider. And I think it has, has real meaning. But after a certain amount of kind of ridicule by my peers and other things, I internalized some of that. And I internalized some broader social anxiety. And I cannot tell you, Guy, how many times I walked out of prom, my high school graduation, later job interviews, meetings, dates, because I would get this fight or flight response, this intense panic. My chest would seize up. It was basically a panic attack, usually triggered by sweating or heat or some discomfort in a physical
Because you
sense.
felt you were sweating too much, and oh my God, I don't want to sweat too much, and these people, I'm going to get too.
And I will be rejected, and I will be I'm gross, whatever it is, right? And I was otherwise a really social guy. Like a lot of people do, I compensated by building up a lot of social skills to try to hide that or get around that. But it never went away. And as it got worse, as I got older, I was medicating with Klonopin, with beta blockers. I tried psychotherapy. Nothing really worked over the long term, but the pills did in acute settings. So I could take Klonopin and beta blockers and get through something, but it would wipe my memory. And so I had this real devil's bargain where I said, okay, I can get through this event. I know I'll get through, but I won't remember it later.
Wow.
And it's horrible. And so, I had that struggle. I was introduced to psychedelics actually in college in kind of a recreational setting. And it was, plant medicine. And it stunned me because it showed me a sense of self-compassion, self-love, self-acceptance that I had never felt before. And I said, this is different. This has real power. And I started researching, and oh my God, there were decades of studies showing that these things could really transform your mental health, but they were locked up. They were locked on the shelf because of crazy regulation. And the founder of Mindbloom actually is one of my best friends from college, going back to my freshman year. And he started this company. He told me what he was doing. And I said, as a lawyer, a lot of people are going to call you crazy. I think there's a way to do this. Most psychedelics are legal, but I think there's a way you can with ketamine therapy. And as he started building this and psychedelics, including Mindbloom, unlocked more for me, I said, I have to go join this. I have to go help. I have to bring this to other people and give them this thing that helped me so much.
Talk a little bit more about, and when we say it helped you, what are we talking about specifically that helped you?
I guess really in the end, it was ketamine therapy. And I'll tell you about my experience with it because it was so profound. And I think a lot of people wonder, like, what's it like? What can I actually expect?
First of all, what is ketamine for those who are listening?
Ketamine is a medicine. It's made in a lab, and it is Historically, it's been considered a dissociative anesthetic. And what that means is that it has both physical effects. It kind of can block or suppress physical pain. In really high doses, it can sedate you, kind of help you go to sleep. But it also causes dissociation, which is a sense of separation from your normal thoughts or feelings. It's like you're still conscious and viewing the world, but you're not viewing them through your own eyes. It's like you borrowed a pair of objective eyes that don't have a person behind them, and you just get to see the world not through the lens of all your past experiences and memories, but just like what is. Mm-hmm. And it was synthesized first and approved by the FDA in 1970 for use as an anesthetic. And so it's actually been on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines since 1985. It's in almost every ambulance you see driving down the street. It's in, dental offices and surgery rooms to help people with medical procedures. But after decades of use, doctors started noticing something. Patients who got ketamine for medical procedures started reporting that they felt better mentally afterwards, that depression lifted, that anxiety lifted. And doctors said, what's going on? And it wasn't until 2000 that the first study was published actually showing in a randomized controlled trial that ketamine is incredibly effective in treating depression. And what's remarkable about it is not just how effective it is, but how fast acting it is. A lot of the studies are showing significant improvements in hours or days after treatment, whereas other antidepressant drugs can take weeks or months to start working. And so in 2000, you had that first, ironclad scientific study by professors and researchers at Yale. And over the past 25 years, there have been more than 100 studies published on ketamine for depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, anorexia. Any number of mental health issues. And this is done at a much lower dose than in an anesthetic context. So what you're talking about is about 10% of the dose you might use in a physical medical procedure. You're using a tiny fraction of that. So you stay awake, you're conscious when you're having the experience, but it does alter your consciousness a little bit. And I can tell you a little how that actually feels when you're doing it.
So that's what it is. Talk about your experience in particular.
Yeah. So I'll give you I'll give you both how it set up and how it actually feels, because when ketamine was used for anesthesia, it was administered intravenously. Back, in a hospital setting, you'd get an IV during a procedure. And when it was discovered that ketamine could help with mental health, it was kind of done the same way. Doctors would administer an IV. And that's really effective. But the problem is it's pretty expensive and it's not that accessible. You had to basically have a few hours to go sit in a clinic if you were lucky enough to live near one. And the price was often about $1,000 a session. And so you had to be lucky enough to live near a clinic to have the time to go sit there for a few hours and have the money to afford it. And what Mindbloom set out to do was actually make that way more accessible and affordable for regular everyday folks. And so the way we operate, and I can tell you more about this later, is we do at-home ketamine therapy with sublingual tablets. And so there's no IV. We have the sublingual tablet. And when I was a client before I actually worked here, so I was doing my sessions in my apartment in New York City. Medicine's delivered to your door, along with a journal, an eye mask, blood pressure cuff, heart rate monitor, things like this to kind of just help with the treatment. You have a guide who is a coach of sorts to really support you throughout the treatment. But when you take the medicine, you're basically taking it under your tongue, putting on an eye mask and headphones, and turning inward. And so I can tell you a little bit more later about the whole program itself, but I want to tell you about my experience. The first time I did it, Guy, it was like noise-canceling headphones for my brain. It was like, I don't know if you've ever done this. I had this great pair of Bose headphones, and you would click them on and it would go whoosh. And it was like being in the woods when they're full of snow and it dampens all the sound. But that's your thoughts, right? Everything just... And you immediately realize the contrast, right? You're like, oh my gosh, I normally have 8,000 thoughts rotating around per second. And that's kind of my anxiety, my rumination. I'm always, how do I look? How do I feel? Am I standing right? What is this thing done? Am I going to miss this deadline? I'm a neurotic lawyer. Like it's how we're programmed.
A lot of us have those too.
Yeah. But all of a sudden, whoosh. And I could have one thought or no thoughts at a time and just be. And I had this sensation, I had this feeling. I'm getting chills thinking about it. I was in an igloo. And I think the igloo is important because it's cold in an igloo, and sweating and heat were always part of my thing. But I'm in this igloo, and in it, there are doors. And each of the doors leads to a different situation that fills me with anxiety. And so that might be a date or a presentation or a job interview, whatever it is. And I could be in that setting. I could be in the physical place experiencing what was happening, but not with the same physical sensations. I didn't have the tight chest. I didn't have the sweating. I didn't have all that stuff. And it was the first time I realized that those weren't inextricably linked. That you, just because you had the trigger didn't mean you had to have the response. And so I would spend time in one room and I would go out and spend time in the next and just experience being in these settings, not feeling that way. And it was unbelievably powerful. And I was there for a bit. You know, you feel the medicine for about an hour, and then you come back to baseline and you journal for a little bit, and then you get back on Zoom with your guide and talk about it. And for me, it was like that holy cow moment. It was just like, this is different. And so for me, step one was really working on that anxiety. And once I worked on that for a while, then it was like, well, what else do I want to work on? And it was really meaning and purpose. It was, what am I doing? Is this right? Is this how I want to devote my energy, my value to the world in my career? And the answer was no. And that's why I went from client to employee here.
That's incredible. That's inspiring. I mean, that experience is really what, in a sense, a certain form of trauma healing is like. Understanding that the trigger is not happening right now. Now, was that an intention for you before you did this? Like
it was
setting an intention
to work on my anxiety, but I didn't really have more specifics than that. It was because I didn't know, I didn't know what to expect. And I think, looking back on it now, I think there's this odd thing that happens with psychedelics where it kind of gives you what you need, but it's not always what you thought you needed going in. And so I think, one of my lessons for mental health is like, we're not very good at predicting things. We overestimate our ability to predict things. We often overestimate how much other people are thinking about us or how much they care about what we're doing. We overestimate how big of a problem something might be in our lives, but we also might overestimate our ability to like fix ourselves and heal ourselves. And I think sometimes what you have to do with psychedelics is just surrender to the medicine and not necessarily say, I'm going to go in and think about this for the whole time, or I'm going to solve this problem. You kind of go in with something broader that says like, I would like to be free from this social anxiety. And then in the session, rather than holding really tightly to that thought, you set the intention and then you kind of release it and you see what comes up. And sometimes it might be that, sometimes it might be an older trauma or memory or something else. But usually I find that something in your brain cues up the thing that you need to work on.
So let's talk more specifically about Mindbloom, what it is, and who it's for.
Yeah. Ultimately, this is at-home psychedelic therapy. We are trying to make this treatment, starting with ketamine therapy, more accessible, affordable, and approachable for people in need. And so when we talk about people in need, I mean, it's almost become a cliche that we're in a mental health crisis, but I think the stats bear repeating. Last year, 55,000 Americans committed suicide. 2 million attempted it. 110,000 died of drug overdoses. There are 47 million Americans taking SSRI antidepressants this year. I mean, those are staggering numbers, right? And when you look at the first-line treatments, the first-line treatments are SSRI or antidepressant pills, what we think of as like Prozac, and psychotherapy. And those help a lot of people. They really do. I want to be clear that those medicines and psychotherapy have helped millions of people. But they don't help everyone. If they did, we wouldn't be in this mental health crisis. If those treatments were all you needed to feel better, the country would look different right now. But instead, you have people that are really suffering. And what we see so often is people who kind of bounce back and forth from one treatment to another, hoping something works, and maybe they get relief for a bit, maybe they don't. And psychedelic medicine really offers something different. I think it offers a way to address the root causes of suffering by not just kind of adjusting chemicals in the brain that mask symptoms, but helping us really get to the bottom of what's causing us depression or anxiety or sadness, grief, whatever that thing is, getting to understand our trauma and how our trauma affects us today, and actually like work past it or resolve those issues in our heads. And so, I think what we're really trying to do is give people a chance to really heal. And, we started with ketamine therapy because it's the only psychedelic that's legal today. And this is kind of heartbreaking because we have this crisis. I mean, I shared these numbers. The other number that I have a hard time wrapping my head around is that 22 veterans commit suicide every single day. Mm. And most of those are people with PTSD from their service. And when you work with psychedelics, they really work in two ways. There's kind of a chemical level, and then there's also a conscious level. And I think the conscious level, it's undersold in some ways. There are some researchers out there who say, oh, it's just the chemical thing, the trip doesn't matter. And I think anybody who's really worked with these medicines knows that's not true, because yes, there is something that happens in your brain, and I can talk about what that is with ketamine, but for me, I think the healing experience of revisiting some of these memories, understanding things, and having the support to actually work through them is what lets you not just address symptoms, but actually like get past these issues. And so, talking about the scope of this problem and the psychedelics that aren't legal today, I mean, MDMA therapy, right? People think of MDMA as ecstasy, party drug. It's the most effective PTSD treatment that's ever been studied. So the trials that were presented to the FDA this year showed that of people with PTSD who got MDMA-assisted therapy, and that's MDMA with psychotherapy, after only 3 medicine sessions and 12 psychotherapy sessions, 87% of patients had significant improvements, and 67% no longer met the criteria for PTSD. They were essentially cured. And as anyone who's worked in the field knows, those numbers are breathtaking, but it's illegal. And it's illegal because of decades of overregulation and stigma attached. And so we started with ketamine therapy, first because it's legal, but second because it is incredibly effective and safe to use. I mean, we've seen, not just with our programs, but with all the research out there, that it's incredibly effective and fast acting, and side effects are incredibly rare. In our study, about 5% of people experienced any side effect. And so it's a really safe and effective and fast acting medicine to use. And, the way it works is so interesting because there's this chemical effect. It works on the default mode network, which is the part of the brain that kind of is self-referential and regulating kind of how am I doing, how am I looking, how am I feeling, and kind of that's where a lot of rumination happens, and it quiets that down. I only learned this after I took it, but my experience of kind of the noise canceling headphones, like that has a real basis in the brain. And it also stimulates the production of something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. They call that fertilizer for the brain. And what the studies show is that in people with chronic depression, the neural connections, the signaling in the brain in the areas associated with mood and emotional regulation, those connections are damaged. There are fewer of them, they're weaker, they break apart. And when you stimulate production of BDNF, you actually regrow those neural connections. You actually are rewiring your brain. And other psychedelics do that too, but they're working at this incredible level to quiet some of that rumination and actually let you grow the neural connections you need to think and feel better. And then it gives you that psychedelic experience of actually altering your consciousness, your perception, and viewing your life or your memories through a different lens that can be so powerful for healing. So it's an absolutely incredible medicine.
Who are some of the people that this is not for?
Yeah, sorry, you asked that question and I kind of went off on a tangent there in terms of who it's for. We currently treat people with depression, anxiety, and PTSD. There are other studies of, anorexia and OCD, which I mentioned. I think those are areas we're really curious about, but do not currently offer treatment for those directly today. The people it's not for, I'll mention a few things. First off, everyone should work with a psychiatric clinician to use this medicine. Mindbloom works with psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants who do the clinical evaluation, prescribing, treatment, etc. It's really important not to try to do this on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a list of criteria that they use to evaluate, who's a good candidate and who's not. Some people who might not be, if you have certain pre-existing conditions, certain heart conditions, certain respiratory conditions can make you a poor candidate. Substance use is interesting. They don't interact with medicines like SSRIs. Ketamine doesn't, so you can keep taking other, mental health medications. But if you have severe substance addiction, maybe, taking a mind-altering substance might not be appropriate. But it really depends, because the studies have also shown it can be really effective in substance use disorder. And so it's kind of a paradox. If you're working with the right clinician and you're doing it, in part to help those substance issues, it can be really helpful. But it may not be appropriate if you haven't started to work on your substance use and if that's not what you're there for. And with trauma, I think it can be really helpful for people with, serious trauma, but you need to have the right support in place. And so this is where I think the type of program really matters. There are some ketamine therapy programs that are basically medicine only. You get, the IV or you get a pill, and that's kind of the treatment. What ours does is different. It's medicine plus coaching, content, and community. What that means is you have the medicine, you have coaching, not just from your clinician, but from a guide who's there to meet with you before and after your sessions to help you prepare for the session, integrate the experience afterwards, recommend meditations or exercises, things you can do, really help you unpack the experience. The content is stuff you do in our mobile app. It's audio for the session, but also journaling and other exercises in between. And the community, we have these group integration circles where people who are going through treatment can meet with others and share their experiences. And, psychedelics, it's like seeing a new color. Once you see it, you're like, oh my God, I want to tell people about this. But if nobody else has seen the color, they're going to be like, whatever, dude, new color, sure.
Right.
So having other people who are doing it also is really valuable. And I think having that support, having the coaching, having the community is what lets, especially people with kind of more severe trauma, do it in a really, in a way that's safe and conducive to healing.
So prior to the actual taking of the medicine, how many meetings are there that lead up to it?
So you come to our website and you can fill out an initial survey with some, threshold questions about, what you're experiencing. Is this right for you? If it is, you can sign up to have a consultation with a clinician, which is between 45 and 60 minutes. And that's kind of like any normal, psychiatrist visit. You're doing a medical history and evaluation. What are you experiencing? For how long? What are your symptoms? All that. And if treatment is appropriate, they will submit a prescription that's sent to your home. Before that first session, you get on Zoom with your guide. And you also have a peer treatment monitor who's home with you. That's usually a friend or family member, someone who's home with you during the treatment session. And that person's really there to create a comfortable environment. It's not, I personally don't think of it as a safety thing. I think of it as like the doorbell rings, the phone rings. Maybe you want, someone to walk you to the bathroom and get you a glass of water or whatever it is. It's really like, let me be comfortable and let go in this session rather than having to think about the house or the dog or whatever else is going on. So before that first session, you've met with your clinician already, and now you are meeting on Zoom with your guide. And that can be 30 to 60 minutes. And it's really, basically like going over how to take the medicine, what to expect, but also preparing and setting intentions. And so an intention is kind of like what I described before, where you're not rigidly holding on to some goal, something specific, but I want to relate better to my mom, or I want to let go of my social anxiety. And you kind of set an intention that guides your journey. And so that Zoom session takes place right before the session. You take the medicine, and about 90 minutes later, you get back on Zoom with your guide to start unpacking it.
Very cool. Now let's talk about what I feel a lot of people might have concerns about is
Mm.
this is not regulated.
Mhm.
Some might say it's the Wild West of psychedelics, right? We don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Things do happen.
Mhm.
Where does all that fit in?
Yeah.
What do you say?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, Guy. I mean, if you read the news, there are a lot of stories out there that speak negatively of ketamine and other psychedelics, that frame them as dangerous or untested or unproven. The science says otherwise. The science is really clear that ketamine is safe and effective and fast acting, and other psychedelics are coming along and kind of building evidence to get to that level. But let's talk about ketamine. It is regulated, maybe more than people think. It is prescribed by doctors and nurses and PAs who are regulated by medical boards and nursing boards. And they sometimes set guidelines around ketamine therapy and other treatments. They certainly can review prescriptions and prescribing practices and treatment plans and all those things. The DEA does regulate the prescription of controlled substances. They keep tabs on where prescriptions are going out, and providers have to register with them. The FDA regulates how medicines are manufactured and marketed. And so I think there's actually more regulation of ketamine therapy specifically than some people might think. I think when people describe the Wild West, I think some of where that comes from is that there's not just one way to do ketamine therapy. Usually when something is approved by the FDA, there's one way. Okay, it's this dose, it's this amount. You take 50 milligrams for this, 100 milligrams for that. Ketamine can be done through IV in a clinic. It can be done through tablets at home, or a nasal spray, or an oral solution. It's kind of evolved through different paths and with different ways of providing it. So again, there's medicine only. You can do it with psychotherapy. You can do it with coaching, like we do. There's enough variety in it that I think people say, how do I get my arms around this? How do I know what's the right way to do it and what's the wrong way to do it? And my answer to that is usually, let's look at the evidence. And so when it comes to Mindbloom, we've actually provided our treatment data to independent researchers and published the two largest studies in the history of ketamine therapy. The first one was the largest ever with, I think it was 1,247 patients. And then the second one was almost 10 times larger at 11,447 patients. And that over that sample size, what you saw, is that 63% of clients have really significant improvements in symptoms. 89% have some improvement overall, and less than 5% are reporting any side effects, which usually are really short-lived and mild, maybe headache or nausea. But, we've now built up so much data that we can confidently say at-home ketamine therapy, when done in this way with medicine plus coaching, content, community, is really helping people and is really safe. And it's really sad to me when I see some of these headlines out there. And I'll give you a specific example. You may be familiar with Matthew Perry's death last year, and ketamine played a role in his death. And, that was a situation where he took insane amounts, massive amounts of recreational ketamine that he got illegally and then went in a hot tub. He was also taking opiates and drinking alcohol. And that's a tragedy. His death is a tragedy. But it's not to say that someone took medically supervised ketamine in an appropriate dose and had a bad outcome. And so, when I look at the big picture with this mental health crisis, there are 500 people that die every year from taking too much Tylenol. I'm not aware of anyone who has died from taking too much ketamine. It's really when people mix drugs and misuse things. And so to me, the really important thing is working with good providers, taking the medicine as directed, just like anything else, just like Tylenol, and following a treatment program that's established and has been shown to be safe and effective, and taking this seriously like any treatment. I think the sad truth is people are really struggling and looking for ways to self-medicate, but the people who know best are the providers who are trained in this, who have gone to school and who have worked for decades to learn how to do this safely and effectively.
I love what you're saying about the content, community, and coaching. The community part to me really stands out. I think it's going to kind of resonate with a lot of our listeners. All right. So how do people learn more about what you're doing, and maybe if they're interested in moving forward with this, where do they go?
Yeah. The best way to do it is to come to mindbloom.com. That's mindbloom.com. We have a bunch of information on the website about what ketamine is, how it works. We have different pathways for issues, whether it's grief or anxiety or more nuanced things like burnout or getting unstuck. We have safety information. We have a blog where we post all kinds of information, not just about ketamine therapy, but other psychedelics. And it's also where people can take that initial survey and sign up.
Okay. We'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Mike, super inspiring, and I really appreciate you sharing your own story. I think that helps people understand your journey and how the heck you got into this.
Well, not just that, Guy. I hope it helps them understand how, ketamine therapy and psychedelic medicine can help them too. I was one of those people who said, well, this is just my life. This is my destiny, is to struggle with this forever. This is my cross to bear, whatever you want to say.
Wow.
Because I tried these treatments for 20 years and nothing worked, and then something did. And if nothing else, I want people to know that, maybe this can work for them too, that this is different from the other medicines they've tried or the other things they've done to try to improve their mental health. This is different. It's unique and it's incredibly effective, and it can work for them too if they, have the right providers, the right team behind them, and the support of a comprehensive program.
Awesome. All right, Mike, we'll be in touch. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Guy. I really appreciate it.